This is the Books and Bitcoin podcast. Today I'm joined with John Vallis. John, you are the host of Bitcoin Rapid Fire and Closing the Loop. Do you also write on Substack and Medium?
Yeah. Well, first, man, thanks for having me on for a chat. But I do. I've started writing. I wrote. Basically, the biggest piece I wrote was something called Money Messiah. I'm not exactly sure how to summarize that, but I guess it looks at the more sort of esoteric or deeper down the rabbit hole speculations about Bitcoin. And since writing that piece, I became inspired to write something longer. So I'm currently working on a book that will borrow from some of those themes, but also flesh them out in much greater detail. So that's where most of my writing is happening these days.
I was going to say, I've heard a few interviews and I was like, dude, John needs to write a book. Hopefully in the book you incorporate some of your life, dude. Are you doing that?
No. This book will just be about, no memoir. It's not a memoir or anything like that. So there's no. I mean, some of my personal beliefs or my philosophies, I'm sure will permeate the book, but no historical anything like that.
Well, I think that's where we should start. I think we should start with memoirs because in your interview with Alex Svetsky, you mentioned that you went to South America and into the Amazon for, I guess it was roughly 3 months when you were around the age of 21 to 22 in hopes of, I guess, becoming, I don't know how to word it, like an ayahuasca shaman, or at least learning the ways.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't exactly sure what I was after at the time. I was like, I just want to go down and immerse myself in this. And if I decide I want to stay, then I'll stay. And if I don't, I won't. And so the summer of maybe 2007 and then the summer of 2008, both times I went down to South America for about 4 months each time and spent the bulk of that time in the Amazon, having ayahuasca ceremonies and spending time with the shaman there and learning more about it. And ultimately, I decided I didn't want to be a shaman. I didn't want to, live in the jungle. But I wanted to go down and learn more about what all this was and what was going on and why it was so important and meaningful to so many people. And so here we are.
What was that experience like? So I've never done any psychedelic, but I have smoked weed, which I guess some people would consider. So what was the whole experience like? So that's 8 months in total in the heart of the jungle doing, I guess, what I would call either the most potent or the second most, if you consider DMT more potent.
Yeah.
So was that completely mind changing?
Well, just to clarify, DMT is what is in ayahuasca. It's just that the administration is different. So when you smoke crystallized DMT, you're getting it through smoke and through inhalation through your lungs. Whereas when you drink ayahuasca, basically it has two primary components. One's the DMT, and one is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor that allows it to be orally active. And so these are primarily found in two plants in the Amazon. The DMT is found in the ayahuasca vine, the DMT is found in what I think is called Psychotria viridis, the plant, and then the MAOI is in the ayahuasca vine, I believe. And then you put those two together and it's able to be orally active. Now, most shamans will put a bunch of other stuff in the brew. So they have a big cauldron and they collect all this stuff. So those two vines and then a whack of other stuff. And then they'll go through the jungle and they'll peel off the bark of this tree or leaves of this one. And they'll say, this is the spirit of so-and-so. This is the spirit of so-and-so. And they'll boil it all down over the course of a day. And, several gallons will become a liter. And you take basically a shot glass full, maybe a little bit more if you more experienced or you want to have more powerful experience. And then if everything goes well, then you're transported to this other place or you have this experience. And as I'm sure you can imagine, and this is what everyone always says, they're kind of ineffable, so they're very difficult to describe. But to answer your question, I think you asked, how did it change my mind? I would say it didn't change my mind that much for two reasons. One, because I'd always had a very open and curious mind. So I was receptive to my thinking being upgraded whenever I was presented with data that would justify that. But also I had had some powerful experiences with psychedelic mushrooms prior to that. And so those were the really kind of transformative ones for me in well, expanding my mind, right? Broadening my understanding of what kind of states of consciousness were possible and the meaning, the potential meaning behind them. And so the ayahuasca, I mean, the experience all taken together was very rich and unique. You're in the jungle and it's a more ceremonial experience than, taking mushrooms back home. But I feel like the actual experience that you're able to gain access to as a result of this, because I don't think anything is really guaranteed. There is an active component of it. But I think you're able to access the same place, whether it's mushrooms or ayahuasca. And I'm not sure how much the context influences whatever differences might be perceived there. So to me, it was just another opportunity to explore the inner landscape, see what's going on in there, seeing what kind of things are latent that haven't been addressed, things that I've been ignoring, things that have been suppressed, and trying to, clear out all the cobwebs so that I can further release into the experience until, you release everything, your notion of yourself, everything that you're holding back, even you're clinging to life. Like if you feel like, you're about to, pass over, then you have to let go of the fear of that. And what seems to be delivered once you do that is a state of extreme connection, peace, and presence. And it's really difficult to describe what that's like, and it's not even that in that state, like necessarily unique insights come to you, but it seems like it leaves a fairly indelible impression or mark on you subsequently. And that is the thing that you kind of wrestle with and integrate subsequent to the experience. And you try to borrow some of that sensation, some of that state of consciousness. You try to invite it more into your life because of the benefit that doing so provides, to the benefit of having more peace and more calm and more focus and more presence and more empathy and those sorts of things can be very useful, to us in our lives. And I would say that those experiences are very conducive to allowing you to do that more effectively.
Okay. So I have a few questions after that. I guess I'll start with the quick, like 1-word answers. Where was home when you were, a child?
Newfoundland, Canada.
Okay. And then was experiences like this, like a 21-year-old leaving the country, leaving, I guess not the continent, leaving the continent to South America to go travel. Were you traveling alone?
Yep.
So was this something common for young people in Newfoundland to do?
No.
Okay.
Not at
so
all.
very, very open-minded from a young age. I think about myself when I was 21, and I didn't think really for myself at all. I was just like, oh yeah, my dad's a Republican, I'm a Republican, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like, yeah, that's the way it is. These Democrats are idiots. America's the best. So yeah, it took a few years to kind of, I guess, work my own mind more open. And then it's really, I'm not trying to like be a simp to you right here, but like it's very courageous. I think about doing that today and I'd be scared. I'd be scared to just go to the Amazon by myself and go to like an experience like that. I'd be like, man, they're gonna drug me and rape me,
Yeah. No, I mean, I can appreciate that. For me, I think the curiosity just always overpowered any sort of trepidation or fear that I might have had, and who knows why we are the way we are. Like I can point to some maybe influences throughout my younger years that might have kind of inspired that sort of attitude, but who knows really? I mean, maybe it's innate in some way, who knows, but it never really registered, one, because I think the image of the world that we have is usually scarier than it actually is. And so I realized that from a young age. But to be honest, man, it was like, I don't really, it's not that I didn't care, but I'm like, do people do this? Have people done this and not been like, died in the jungle and been poisoned and stuff? They have? Okay, well then I'm sure I can handle it, and my curiosity to, broadly speaking, pursue truth, or at least pursue experiences that might better help me contextualize my understanding of the world, are paramount. And I'm not going to let loneliness or fear or anything get in the way of that. It's too important for me.
Was it lonely? Or was there a sense of community there amongst or were you alone essentially when you got there, just you and a shaman, or was there like a group, like a class?
Both times the first time there was just two other people with me, and then the next time I was there, I think there was six others. So that's always fine. I mean, to answer the first question, I don't really get lonely. Like I've always enjoyed time to myself, and I like to think or read or write, or like I'm just not someone who has a problem spending time with myself, I guess. And so if there's people there, great, because I love to meet other people and hear about their experiences. I mean, one of the surprisingly meaningful aspects of that trip, the second one, I think, was before we like took the riverboat up into the town of the shaman. There's a town called Iquitos, which is like it's the biggest, I think it's the largest city in the world that doesn't have a land-based route to it, but it's the main city in Peru in the Amazon. And that's where you go. And then that's a jumping off point to going deeper into the Amazon. And there's like a Texas barbecue joint right along the river. Like some big, fat Texas dude decided to just opt out and go to Iquitos and run a barbecue thing. You get like, I remember having fried crocodile there, like crocodile nuggets or whatever. Super good. But anyways, on two separate occasions, I was there one night just having a beer, watching the sun go down or something. And on one night, I ended up striking up like a 5-hour conversation with a guy who was probably in his 60s and he was dying of cancer. And then the next night, the same thing happened, except it was a guy, 60s, 70s, and he was dying of AIDS. And in both occasions, we just had these, because people that are near death, I mean, they don't have much trepidation about being honest and open, right? Because what do I care? I'm not going to be around any longer. So what do you want to know? Like, I'm an open book. And so, I was just able to have really, really fascinating and deep conversations with these two guys. And that was before even going off into and doing the ayahuasca stuff. And, those were super interesting and meaningful. So like the truth, right? Or insights or mind expanding ideas or knowledge can come from many different places, right? Not just psychedelic ceremonies and not just books and not just the internet, but, through conversation with people and understanding and empathizing with their situations and trying to borrow the wisdom that they've accumulated, and tease that out of them. And so, I can't remember why I brought that up, but those two were definitely a meaningful part of, the whole trip or experience for me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that leads to a greater question of like, what is the truth? There really is. There's your truth. There's my truth. There's someone who's listening's truth, but there isn't like a real truth, I guess. Yeah, except for like 2 equals 4. Like there's certain things.
It's a tricky question. And I guess it's a little bit too vague. I shouldn't use that type of language because you need context to determine what kind of, as you say, like in the context of 2 + 2, what is the truth? Well, it's 4. And so I think when we talk about these bigger, deeper, meaningful truths, like what is the meaning of life and what is the meaning of consciousness, and how should one determine value, and then how should one orient themselves in the world? What should one be pursuing with our limited time and resources in this life? Like, what's the most worthwhile thing to pursue? Is it the accumulation of material resources? Is it the accumulation of meaningful relationships? Is it the accumulation of beautiful experiences? Is it the accumulation of nothing and the appreciation of presence? So those are the big eternal questions that have always been difficult to answer. But I think they're compelling because there's a sense that there actually is an answer. Like perhaps there is like an absolute value that if you align with it, aligning with it is the most rational thing to do as a sentient human being, let's say.
No, that's really good.
Yeah,
That's
and
really good.
that's kind of the notion, or at least the premise behind religion and systems of spirituality and stuff throughout the ages. Now, of course, they layer on a lot of stuff on top of that, but and maybe there isn't, but we seem to have an impulse or a presumption or a premise that there is, and those of us who are sufficiently intrigued by that, I guess we pursue it to try to see if we can answer that question, at least for ourselves, if for nobody else. And for whatever reason, I've always been infatuated or interested in that question.
So I'm going to kind of go back when you said, I guess you dealt with loneliness well, or you've never really felt loneliness. I've always kind of thought that like a sense of community was part of like the evolutionary thing that's made humans human, made us succeed, because certain projects you just can't do alone. You can't build a great pyramid alone. You have to have like a sense of community. It's like Planet of the Apes, like ape alone weak, ape together strong, something like that.
Right.
So I feel like we're supposed to feel loneliness in a sense. It's supposed to, like, it's an instinct that should drive us to be in a community. And that's part of that. I think that's what like religion stems from. It stems from people wanting to belong and then needing to feel like self-important in the greater scheme. I don't know. Like, I've always been religious. I've always been Christian. And just recently I've started like kind of doubting it. Like, I don't know, it's just born and bred in me. So kind of going off of what I just kind of just ranted on. Are you religious? Were you raised religious?
Before I answer that, just another way of looking at what you just said is, like you said, there's kind of like evolutionary imperative to feel loneliness so that it would inspire you to seek out community for all the benefits that community entails or provides. And I would agree with that, but it may not be the case that you need to feel loneliness. I think another way of looking at that, and it might just be semantic, would be, you could say you want to be able to appreciate or value community without necessarily feeling lonely, like recognizing the benefits of community, of cooperation, of brotherhood, of all those things is one thing, but maybe it doesn't necessitate or require loneliness to do that. You can just appreciate the value for still the benefits, but still, when you're on your own, not suffer loneliness and not feel that you're deprived of anything if you're forced to be by yourself, and you're able to amuse yourself, or you're able to be comfortable or confident in and by yourself. So that, just a comment on that. But no, in terms of my religion, my faith or lack thereof, it's an increasingly hard question to answer. If the question is like, do I exclusively ascribe to one of the major religious doctrines as they exist in the world today, the answer is no. But one, I appreciate the wisdom that is contained within all of them, basically. And I'm not equating them either. I mean, perhaps I wouldn't know how to compare them really, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in many of them. But I don't currently subscribe to one exclusively. And I think part of my ambition or objective in the book I'm writing is to explain my perspective on that and try to tease out the logic of what my perspective is on that. And it's not 100% clear in my mind yet, so it's difficult to articulate. But what I said before, like I think it's quite possibly the case that consciousness and the universe and everything is not purely subjective. Like as you get into the economic realms of things, all value is subjective, and what's valuable to you may not be valuable to me. And of course that's true. But is there a truth? Is there a value? Is there a principle or set of them that actually are so fundamental that they're not subjective? Like, whether or not you recognize them, you're subordinate to them. And you could, a corollary here would just be in like physical laws, right? Like gravity. Gravity is not subjective. You might not care that if you jump off a building, you're going to die. Maybe you have a death wish or something, but you're going to be subjected to that law. You're going to be subjected to the consequences of it. And I think what part of the religious enterprise is trying to say, look, what are the forces to which we are inevitably subject, that greatly determine the peace or the fulfillment or the meaning, and even sometimes perhaps the happiness, but maybe that's not the best metric, of our lives. Like, why is it that when we do certain things, when we say certain things, when we have certain experiences, they fill us with peace, joy, and happiness versus despair and anger and, what would be called negative emotions? Why is it? Why is consciousness oriented that way? Why does consciousness interact with the world in that way to produce those sentiments or those experiences? And I do think the religious enterprise has been in part an attempt to answer that question, like what could possibly be ordering the universe that would result in those sorts of experiences, sort of thing. And this is why I respect them so much, because I think they've done really great work in that regard. Like the modern secular opinion is like, oh, all religion is a stupid like superstition and we don't need it anymore because we're all rational and modern and awesome. And I just think that's a hugely arrogant and hubristic approach. I'm not saying the religious institutions are clearly fallible, and they've clearly, been corrupted in various ways throughout their history. But it doesn't mean, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It doesn't mean there's nothing of value there. And I think I'm hoping that as we move into a hyper Bitcoinized world, a Bitcoin standard world, a more rational and considerate approach will be taken to the wisdom that we've been able to accrue in the past around this issue, and we'll take what still holds up and we'll discard what doesn't, and what was corrupted and what's been perverted, let's say, and we'll combine it with the knowledge and wisdom that we're gaining as a result of being in the world that we are in today, and all the resources we have for understanding the world. And who knows? I don't know what that's going to result in, but I think the reason why religion has always been central to civilization is because there is no greater pursuit. Because at the end of the day, it's trying to answer the question, how should I act? Mm-hmm. How should I be? What should I value most? And how should that dictate what I devote my limited time, energy, and time and energy resources to? I mean, that's all there is, right? It's human action. So how do you constitute human action? And I think religions have been trying to answer that question. And I don't think we're going to dispense with that question. I think we're just going to continue on that road of hopefully refining the answer more and more, and hopefully have that refined answer deliver to us greater peace and joy and prosperity and happiness in life.
Man, I had so many things I wanted to say while you were talking. I didn't want to cut you off and like try to bring it back to something else. So just on the last note, based off of what you just said, if you were to philosophize with me, is Bitcoin a religion?
Well, let's have a look at it together. You hear a lot of language in religion. Well, again, to the point of like, what's the point of religion? Well, it's trying to aid or offer
instill purpose is how I would kind of think of it.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. It's again, broadly speaking, it's trying to answer the question, how should I orient myself in the world? And, what should I pursue? What's the most worthwhile thing to pursue? Or even better, what's the most worthwhile way of being? Because we can't always draw a straight line from our intent to the outcome, because the world is chaotic, but we can control how we exist, how we act, the values and principles by which we act. That is the thing that's most in our control. And I think religion tries to answer that question. And as a result of, let's say, succeeding at least in part, right, let's put it this way. I think you can tell what people really believe, what their values and their principles are, by observing their action. And I look at, let's say the church several hundred years ago, and people would worship, they would devote themselves to, understanding God, let's say, or understanding Christ or embodying Christ. They would sacrifice many things to that. And, the whole idea of sacrifice is, I think, misunderstood in the modern era. But in any case, the doing a bad job at explaining the correlation. But I think if we look at people and we say, what's the most meaningful thing in your life right now, especially Bitcoiners? Well, absent or aside from, let's say, family, a lot of people would probably say Bitcoin. And you say, why? Well, I think it has the greatest capacity to do the most good. Okay, that's interesting. And then you look at what's happening to them. And a lot of people are being transformed. And what are they being transformed by? They're being transformed by the attempt to understand the thing that is having the greatest positive impact. And so they're inviting the principles that they find in Bitcoin into their own life. And they're kind of comparing how they act and their value hierarchies to this thing that is Bitcoin. And I think that relationship is very similar to the relationship where a religious person might have with whatever the top of the hierarchy religious figure is, whether it's Christ or Buddha or whomever. Like it's a type of way of judging yourself, of determining if you're on the right path. Like, am I embodying the principles of that character? Am I embodying the principles of something like Bitcoin? Am I only speaking the truth? Am I treating everyone as if fundamentally they have equal value? Like, so I think there's a component of that. But even further, I look and say, what's the biggest determinant of religious behavior? And I think you almost have to say, well, it's devotion. Mm-hmm. And that means like you're devoting yourself to something. And whenever I speak with Bitcoiners, whether they're working in the space or not, but particularly if they are already, it's like, hey, like, what are you up to? Oh, I'm so interested in Bitcoin. I'm devoting all my time to it. Like, I'm working so hard to contribute to it. And so if you pierce the kind of secular veneer of what, like, people's behavior, I think you see a lot of similar behavior that would liken it to how a very religious person would treat, their religion or the top figure of the faith. And so, I mean, I think there's many other elements to that, and I don't think I've articulated that too well. But to answer your question, I think we will come to appreciate more and more that I think two things will happen. We're going to redefine what religion is. We're probably going to do what I said before, whereas we're going to take the valid, beneficial aspects of that relationship, and we're going to recognize and do away with the corruptive, unfair, imbalance aspects of that relationship. And then we're going to compare it to how people, the relationship that people have constituted with Bitcoin and its capacity to affect positive change or to promote the good in the world. And I think we're going to end up realizing that there's a lot of similarities between those two things. And I mean, and so I wouldn't be surprised if it formed into a quasi sort of religion. In fact, it probably already is. And then
there's probably a church of Bitcoin somewhere.
Yeah, and you look at how it's inspiring people. You look at the art, the memes, the books, the statues, the movies, everything. And we're so early in this. We're 13 years into this, and look at what this thing is inspiring in people. And I only see that amplifying. And again, you look at the religious example and look at all the works that were made in the name of fill in the blank religious belief or religious person, because the meaning that it contained was so inspiring that people felt compelled to transmute it into the physical world, right? You want that marble statue or that magnificent cathedral or whatever, like you want the beauty of that's contained in the meaning of that thing to have a physical existence, and you devote yourself to that endeavor. And I see something extremely similar starting to happen in Bitcoin. So, the early Christians were known as the people of the book, right? And someone recently coined the term "people of the coin," and I find it to be an interesting parallel.
Yeah. No, yeah, I see the parallels. That's kind of why I asked it. Like, I just kind of wanted you to confirm my bias that it is damn near a religion. Um, yeah, I feel like I have a lot of like similar beliefs as you, where I was always Christian as a child, and then recently I've been thinking like, here, I'll just lay out my thought. All right,
Sure.
the universe is infinite; it goes on forever. That's at least what I've been told. I don't know. I'm not an astrophysicist, but with that, if that is true, then there is infinite Earths. There's infinite other planets with life. So why do we have Jesus? Why do we have the Prophet Muhammad? Why do we have John Smith? Why are they important? Why are they God's son or God's, messenger? If there's 7,000 other planets with, people, I don't know. I just feel like it's almost like a narcissistic belief to think, okay, we're the one planet with life and we have the one Messiah and only us are going to, heaven, afterlife, whatever you want to call it, Valhalla.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just kind of my thought. And after thinking that, I'm like, well, okay, there could be a God. Surely they could have created it, but every religion ever created was man-made and they could all be wrong. That's just my thought. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable and rational way to think about it. And this is where the religious people, part of their argument is untenable, because each one of them will say, well, no, mine is the actual truth and everyone else's is like, a facade, or it's the devil, or it's untrue in some way. It's like, well, okay, but if everyone makes that claim, where are we? Because if everyone is just if your thing is the actual truth by definition, then one, you're going to be impervious to any logic or reason that might suggest otherwise, or at least might suggest a more plural sort of approach to the truth. And then two, you're going to be forever kind of in conflict with all the other ones that think the exact same way. And why is it that your assertion is more valid than theirs? And I, of course, I totally agree with that. But I do think, God is such a difficult concept to talk about and certainly to nail down. But I think it's more the case that these religious narratives and these mythological narratives that have popped up throughout history do so because there's a great benefit to kind of being able to articulate a composite of what all the best values and virtues and orientations would be, so that people can kind of, first of all, they can play with that. You play it out in the narrative universe to see what story develops when you have certain characters. I think that's been part of the role of narrative and myth and story. But I also think we want, as right back to the beginning of this conversation, we want to be able to answer the question, who am I and who should I be? How should I orient my behavior? I'm a blank slate, right? You come out, the world is your oyster. What's the most logical thing to pursue? And or again, the clarification we made before was not even pursue, because there's so much unknown about everything. How should I constitute my action? What should be the primary determinant of my action? What values, what principles, all that stuff. And I think these so-called mythological heroes, throughout time, long before Christ and many after, try to be a representative or an answer of that question, and for people to aspire to, or to help guide or inform people. And I'm not just saying that I think that like those stories are made up for that reason, because the question still remains, why is it that someone acting in that way, constituting their behavior with certain values and principles, why is it that they are so successful? Why is it they can have the best experience of life in this earth and universe that we exist in, right? Because it's clearly not arbitrary. Why is it someone who, well, again, I'm not going to try to define it, but why is it someone who's constituted their life properly is delivered a sense of peace that someone who has pursued the wrong values by which to orient their behavior, let's say, doesn't have access to. Like, and I think that says something broadly about how consciousness is interfacing or was developed by the universe. Like there's a reason why there's a difference between those two things. There's a reason why there's a difference in the outcomes of someone holding a certain belief or value or principle or a set of beliefs, values, and principles than someone who's holding a different set. And the question remains is like, well, why the different treatment? Why the different outcomes of acting in those ways? And I think part of the notion of God is, as we were saying earlier about gravity, is it's the force that those something about those values or principles is interfacing with and is kind of pushing up against and those values or principles are kind of determining the consequences of that invisible force that, you know, some have called God. So it's not just that you make up a convenient story so that people will cooperate or be docile or they'll have something to aspire to. It's also very much a question of why is it acting a certain way is generative rather than degenerative or destructive, let's say.
Yeah, it's almost like I mean, when you're talking, I kind of like went into this like brainstorm. It was based off of what you were saying. I wasn't ignoring you, but it's almost like it's almost like if you have a God or a religion or a belief system, and then you practice it, you train your conscious. You know, like the word like guilty conscious. It's almost like you train that and you form it into your belief system. So when you act out of line, you feel guilty, or when you act in line, you feel accomplished. I don't know. It's just something that I was thinking about when you're talking, because I was thinking like, man, I was thinking about the times I had like fucked up in the past, like say I cheated on my girlfriend or something, and then it just ate me alive until I, you know, told them and broke up or whatever. And it's just like,
and the question is, where does that judge come from?
Yeah, and it's like I am my own judge, but I feel judged by God. But you know,
right? I mean, where does your conscience, that inner voice that says this is right, this is wrong, what's that about? Where's that coming from? You know, is it purely socially constructed? And even if it is, why does the social matrix identify, you know, good and bad? You know, so another way of looking at this could simply be call God whatever it is that's the prime determinant of your behavior. Then, so, you know, and Peterson talks a lot about this, you know, everyone has an internal value hierarchy, you know, and so that determines your behavior because you're always going to be orienting yourself towards the thing that you actually value the most, not what you say you value, not what you believe, but your actions will reveal the thing that you care most about, the thing that you're most willing to exchange your limited resources, time, energy for. And so that thing, whatever it is for each of us, you can almost, maybe it's not right to call that God, but like the closest thing to it, because it's the thing that's most motivating your behavior. And the question then, I think part of the religious enterprise is recognizing that, is that something in our consciousness is most orienting our behavior. And I think the question they're trying to answer is, what would be the best thing to have orient your behavior? So recognizing that there can be a million different things that orient your behavior and construct your value hierarchies and have something at the top of that hierarchy. But what would be the best thing to have at the top of your value hierarchy such that it facilitated the quote unquote best or most fulfilling or most meaningful or most peaceful or joyful or blissful life that a human is capable of having, in conjunction with, you know, sharing that life with other people, right, in the social world. And then again, back to that question, like if to whatever degree you kind of are able to zero in on an answer to that, like what would be the best thing to have at the top of your value hierarchy, the question remains, why is it that thing that's best? What is it about consciousness and reality and the universe that makes that value the most productive or beneficial? And, you know, then you get into God territory with that.
No idea. All right. So I kind of want to spin the subject off of religion. So I'm going to ask you just two random questions as a bridge to that gap. Someone walks in, they give you $10 million. What do you spend it on?
Bitcoin.
Okay. All the way?
Yeah.
Do you do anything like what's the fucking word? You know, like you build a charity or a school, or
No,
you just
right now
buy
it's
all Bitcoin?
buy Bitcoin. I'll figure out
Yeah, it's like
what to do with it
15,000
later.
a day. Yeah, it's a good day to buy.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Second question is literally just like 7 questions. Who, what, when, where, how? Who, what, when, where, how, and why? Which one of those questions would you value the most?
Why?
I knew you were going to say it, dude. Why is like the answer of a philosopher. How is the answer of an engineer, and the other ones are kind of just gossip.
Right.
All right, now that I've bridged the gap, I want to ask you about your time in China. Because I was listening to you, I guess it was you, Preston, a few other people, y'all were just like chatting.
Mm-hmm.
And then you brought up China, and you said you were like the contrarian in the room that thought China could change because it doesn't always have to be a totalitarian regime. So I just kind of want to ask you about I don't know, tell me about your time in China. What brought you there and how was it?
Yeah, Cole's notes is I thought, I've been thinking about like I guess the easiest way to put it is I wanted to be wealthy from a very young age. And, I just for whatever reason I landed on I read a bunch of books about investing and stock markets and stuff when I was, I don't know, 14, 15 years old. And I was like, all right, this must be it, right? Manage money, make money, easy peasy. And then I thought, well, where's the best place to do this? And because I was also wondering, like, why is the world the way that it is? And I was very interested in history for my whole life, and so understanding why the world is the way it is, the next question is, well, where do you think the world is headed? And my assessment of things led me to believe that, China was going to be the next great superpower of the world, and that Shanghai, being its most commercial city, was going to be like New York in the early 1900s. And as a 20-year-old, I was like, okay, so I go to Shanghai, I get a job in finance, and seems rational. And so after my time in the Amazon, I got a one-way ticket to Shanghai, and stayed in a hostel until I found, I was trying to find a job in finance. I was putting a bunch of resumes out, didn't get anything. And then I was at a UFC fight at a bar one night because I've been a diehard UFC fan forever. And I was sitting next to a guy, and he just happened to be like a recruiter for one of the big wealth management firms in town. And so he got me an interview, went through that process, and ended up working there. Now, the story on that is basically it's just a glorified sales role. And I didn't like the attitude of the people or the work or anything there. So I left after 2 years. But that's how I wound up there. And life in China, well, life in Shanghai, and I did a stint in Beijing as well, but particularly Shanghai is awesome. I mean, if you can deal with the air pollution, because it still has bad air pollution on most days, but it's, it's great. The city is a very modern, very clean, very efficient. It's very safe. There's lots of opportunity. The whole world is converging there. There's all the big brands in the world are doing all their big projects there. So there's always exciting things happening to do. And the young Chinese people are incredibly bright, incredibly curious, just very worldly, very well put together. So it's just a great place to be. And there's not any ever interaction with the government, like you get your work visa and that's about it. Like, the government is not a part of people's lives. People just get on with doing their thing. It's not like it's a very, if people have a perception that it's like command and control economy, that's just not it. Like, yes, the government has partial ownership in a lot of enterprises or like the big enterprises. Like, there's a lot of state-owned enterprises, let's say, but down a level, it's very free market everywhere. And the Chinese people are the most entrepreneurial people I've ever encountered in my life. And so day-to-day life is just super cool. But what we were discussing on that podcast was, because I find in the West, people are a little bit too dismissive of China. And I understand the argument, right? It's like, hey, like, do you believe in free markets or not? Do you believe in the ability of free markets to ultimately outcompete, constrained, restricted, or controlled markets? And I absolutely do. But one, again, to the point, like, China is not as a restricted market as some people think.
And
Two,
we're not as free as people think.
well, there you go. Yeah, that. It also has 1 billion more people than the US. So to like, how much wiggle room for lack of freedom does that give them in an economic sense? And I like, they're highly educated population. They graduate more engineers every year than the US has graduates, period. They have huge natural resources and have gone around the world buying up natural resources. And so I think just saying like, oh, well, the government is communist, therefore not sufficient freedom to compete with, as you said, like other so-called free states. But, even the US is far from a pure free market. And therefore, like, the China story is just another Japan, a kind of flash in the pan. And I just think that's a very narrow way of looking at it. I think it's quite possible, one, that the government there'll be crises, of course, right? As every country experiences. And was there overbuilding and a lot of misallocated capital? Absolutely. Is there too much debt in the system? Absolutely. Have they printed too much money? Absolutely. Will that come back to bite the government in the ass at some point? Most likely. And maybe that will facilitate a change in government. Like maybe 30 years from now, we're having this conversation and China is a democracy or a monarchy or whatever. Like, it's no longer the system of government it is today. But I like, that's something that could easily change. Whereas the geography, the population, the education, the drive, all that kind of stuff, that's not really going to change. And so now that they got through that really messy period of the, 60s, 70s, and 80s, let's say, where, the great leap forward, so-called, and now they're basically modernized, I think they'll have their ups and downs like everybody else, but I think they'll be a force to be reckoned with for a long time. And then, as I said on that podcast, it's like the US or Europe or wherever also has way too much debt and also has printed way too much money and also has all these other problems. So what are the metrics that we're actually comparing these jurisdictions or these countries or these markets to each other with? And then my final comment on that, and part of the reason why I left China, was because of Bitcoin. Because, as I said, like, from the time I was a teenager, I was trying to understand how the world worked and where the world was going. And it seemed pretty clear pre-Bitcoin. It's like, okay, civilization started in the Fertile Crescent, right? In Sumeria and ancient Egypt, and then the Indus Valley, and then on into Europe, ancient Greece, Rome, discovery of the New World, developing in China, so that all happened. And then, like, in the age of imperialism, let's say, you had Portugal and you had Spain, and then you had Britain, and then you had the US. And, so like history had a pretty discernible pattern. And then you just thought, okay, well, China is the next big dog on the block. And so, in the 21st century and beyond, they'll probably be the dominant economic and military power. But then Bitcoin happens. And Bitcoin is an entirely unprecedented phenomenon that just changes the calculus for, well, the course of history, in my opinion, fundamentally. And so the mechanisms of power and influence and the institutions of the world and the ways of governing and the taxation or violability of property, let's say, and all those things are just totally different now when we consider Bitcoin. And so how does that change that progression that's been happening for the last 5,000 years of how states rise to power and consolidate power and become a dominant power? And then there's churn over the course of centuries and millennia. And, who knows how it's all going to turn out? It would be presumptuous of me to just say, like, China is going to dissolve into a bunch of city states and stuff. Like, I think we're going to have massive nation states for a while. But what happens when everyone in the world is able to secure their wealth beyond the reach of any centralized government that would want to try to steal from them, either overtly or surreptitiously through inflation? And that will necessitate the shrinking of those centralized governments. And how how capable are they going to be at maintaining such large bureaucracies and large geographic regions of influence when they can't so easily fund themselves through stealing from people? And how are people's movements going to be like when they have complete flexibility, when they can, walk across the border with their wealth intact, as they say, and when they can go wherever they're treated best or wherever they want to be, and the competition that gets kicked off between jurisdictions as a result of that. So I think we're going into an era that governments and states are going to shrink dramatically. And that process will probably be messy because they're not going to want to relinquish that power, without a fight, perhaps. But that seems, that's how Bitcoin has changed the calculus of how I see the world and how I see the progression of history playing out.
Yeah. Man, when you were talking, I was thinking about like the Fourth Turning. I'm sure you read it. I feel like everybody in the Bitcoin.
I actually haven't. I've heard people talk about it, but I haven't read it.
your thesis, it hits it pretty good. It's pretty much, oh shit, maybe it wasn't the Fourth Turning. Maybe it was
the
called
Sovereign Individual. Yeah, I read that. It's a great book.
Okay, I always get those two confused. Yeah, it was the Sovereign Individual. And dude, it was like, yeah, that's it.
They nailed it. It's fucking spooky how well they nailed it.
They wrote that in like 79 or something like that?
97, I think. 97. But okay, still, they still nailed it.
I'm really not dyslexic. I just lied. There was something else you said. Oh, I was thinking about, okay, like, how today a country kind of gets its power from its natural resources, whether they're oil rich like Saudi Arabia, or if they have titanium and lithium and everything you need to make a smartphone like China, or parts of Africa, I guess, too. I think like if a country has friendly regulation to Bitcoin, it's essentially like a magnet that just draws in that natural resource, even though it's, I guess, an artificial resource, Bitcoin, into it. So essentially, I guess when you left China had a very anti-Bitcoin stance. I think there was a point in time where they were actually friendly to it, right? They flipped.
Yeah. Yeah, it was super popular. Well, not amongst like retail, but it was pretty much the center for Bitcoin for a lot of Bitcoin's early history. And then, the government in China does things weirdly. Like they've banned Bitcoin many times, but it's always like, well, what does the ban mean? Like, can you still buy and sell it? Can you hold it? Can you do whatever? It's always very opaque. Like that's kind of how they run. They don't want to, for whatever reason, be overly specific in some of their dictates, at least around Bitcoin, it seemed. But I remember in the fall of 2017, they did another ban, and I wasn't sure what it meant at the time, but I think that's when some of the exchanges started shutting down or exiting because it was a little bit more real this time. And then, of course, in 2021, they had the mining so-called ban. Now, I think there's still quite a bit of hash rate in China, but obviously a lot of hash rate left. And so it's super interesting, right? Because on the one hand, you'd say like among the big powers, they don't, they're the most resistant to Bitcoin because they have the most to lose, let's say. But at the same time, when are they going to realize that if you're up against something that can't be stopped, the only rational response is to try to maximize, try to position yourself as well as possible for the change that's coming, rather than try to ignore it or ban it or act like it doesn't exist. Now,
yo, you're a trooper, man. Thank you so much. How long was that? 10 minutes. It just
man. It's happened. All this shit's happened to me a million times. It's all good.
Recording is still there. Oh well.
Yeah.
Yo.
Dude,
what the fuck? All right, it cut out again. All right, so to fucking just change subjects entirely from China, because I feel like I'm cursed. As I was talking to you before this started, the Immortality Key. It was either written by like Robert Maresca or James Maresca. I don't remember.
Brian Murarescu.
Brian. I was gonna get there eventually. So that book, I haven't finished it. I'm on like chapter 12 of 17. And it lays the groundwork that early Greeks and Christians and Jewish people and Romans or whatever, when they drank wine, they drank like psychedelic shit. And that was the key to immortality. That was the afterlife. That was heaven. That was the Eucharist. That was the blood and the flesh, however you word it.
Mm-hmm.
When you read that book, how did you feel? Did you feel that there was any accuracy? I mean, I guess there's historical evidence presented in the book, but
well, yeah, I mean, on that point, I felt that it was incredibly well researched. You know, he was very meticulous in doing his research for that book. So that was one takeaway. But the general takeaway was, I mean, I think there's two main themes, right? One is that there's a lot of cross-pollination between religions, especially religions that formed in similar places and similar times, right? So if you imagine the Middle East, you know, from the beginning of civilization, really. So let's say 3,000-4,000 BC up to you know, the time of Christ, or like the Common Era, so-called. A lot, you know, there was a ton of different peoples in that region, ton of different systems of faith, ton of different religions, and a lot of them took on very similar form, whether it was in the characters that were in them, or the ideas, or the values, and all of that kind of stuff. And a lot of, you know, the rituals and stuff would be similar. And so, you know, of course, right? Because where is the definitive line between a people, you know, and what they believe? Well, there isn't one, right? There's always movement of people, there's trade, systems of faith and belief are being shared. And the ones that you know, are so-called better or more interesting to people, or more beneficial, or what have you, they get propagated more, or ones that are adopted by the dominant geopolitical and economic power at the time, they get adopted and they get spread more broadly as a result. So that was the one broad takeaway, is that there's a lot of cross-pollination. He makes the case that the cult of Dionysus. All right, so you dropped out again, but I'm going to finish this answer to this question. So he makes the case that the cult of Dionysus, which was operable in Greek prior to the Christian era, there was a lot of overlap and there was a lot of borrowing between early Christians and that cult, or that system of faith, or that religion. And he, you know, showcases that through the terminology, the imagery, the iconography, all that kind of stuff. And he looks at the, you know, the underground catacombs in Rome, and how early Christians, you know, worshipped in secret and stuff like that. And so that's one of the main thesis of the book, is the overlap, or the similarity and the cross-pollination of different religions that emerged in similar places in the world. And even interestingly enough, very different places in the world, you know. So back to our earlier conversation, part of the conversation, like, why is it that a religion that developed in, you know, Central America 3,000 years ago has similar tenets than one that emerged in the Middle East 3,000 years ago? So interesting question. The other aspect of the book was just that early religions used altered states of consciousness as part of their sacramental rituals. And I would say that that's because a lot of systems of faith, if you go back pre-civilization, were predicated on some form of shamanism, some form of intentional altering of consciousness to convene with the divine, so-called. And he focuses on Eleusis, which was outside of Athens in ancient Greece, as a center for where these rituals took place, and where they, for I think thousands of years, even prior, like it was established very, very early on in ancient Greece, and was basically the pillar of that civilization. And the elite from that society, you know, whether they be philosophers or politicians or, you know, business people or whatever, would go and have this experience once in their life. They'd be part of the ritual, and they would describe it as being the most significant, most meaningful event of their lives. And so this institution was kind of responsible for, or at least this is how people felt about it, it was responsible for upholding the culture and keeping it revivified as and when it needed to be. And so, and then in the book, he details how when ancient Greece kind of fell and Eleusis was destroyed, how it moved to other centers across the Mediterranean, in Italy, in Spain, in France, to continue on these rituals, and how they served as a basis for cultures that may have flourished in those new places. And to me, to answer your question, my response is just, I was kind of like, I appreciated the rigor that he devoted to research and documenting all this. And it's really cool to see the new information that's coming up about how they're testing these, the chalices and stuff they find for residues of different psychoactive compounds. But for me, it was kind of, that's what I already suspected, that religions were kind of developed in relation to one another. And so there was a lot of overlap, a lot of borrowing of themes and characters and such and things like that. And that at the core of religions is a mystical experience of some kind, not only because that's how they were founded, pre-civilization, pre-writing, early shamanism, but because I think that's the mystical experience is when the notion of the divine leaves the realm of the purely intellectual and becomes experiential. And I think that was and is an incredibly important part of one's relationship to the divine and to whatever may exist beyond our current knowledge, if we don't want to call it divine, just whatever greater order that exists between consciousness and the universe. That experience helps you learn more about it. And for that reason, and inform how you should act and behave and orient yourself, which we were discussing earlier in the conversation. And so for that reason, I think that's why it was so integral and so important to these institutions, and why people tried to carry it to new places when the old places were in decline or were destroyed or they were persecuted in some way. And so if we're still recording, that is the answer to that question. And I suppose the ending of this podcast for now. Dylan, it's been awesome to chat. Don't worry about the technical difficulties. It happens to me all the time. And thanks for having me on, man. We'll do it again sometime. Peace.